Hey, so this is going to be a follow-up to my last World Building for Beginners video. You absolutely don't have to watch that one first if you haven't seen it, but I think there's some good stuff in there. Anyways, what's this one about? These are the topics that I'm going to go over. This advice is intended for beginners, but even if you're already an experienced DM or world builder, there might still be some useful tips inside. It may sound obvious, but the setting needs to be able to support a party of adventurers going on adventures, so create some imperfections in your world. Stains, dirty spots, dark corners and crevices where danger lurks. Create places or people that have problems that need to be solved. They can be big, sprawling problems like a disease spreading across the land, or smaller, local problems like goblins stealing a farmer's chickens. And honestly, have both kinds if you can. Using those two as an example, maybe the disease is causing a widespread food shortage, so the goblins have to steal food to survive. You don't always have to find a way to tie the big picture to the little, but if you can, it's a great way to increase the immersion and make the setting feel like a real, lived-in place. If you want, you can think of and use the big problem, like the disease, as an overarching issue that the players will see throughout the setting. And then you can have the smaller adventures tied to that overarching problem so the players can slowly chip away at it and feel like heroes making a difference in the world. Alternatively though, if the players aren't really focused on solving the overarching problem, it can still provide obstacles and hazards and roadblocks for them and keep the setting feeling really thematic. Now, as for how you actually implement stuff like that into your world, it can be tricky sometimes. A lot of the problems in our real world could be solved with simple magic from D&D, so you'll have to get creative with certain kinds of problems. But at the same time, think about how advanced our technology and science is now. Yet, some parts of the world are still struggling with things we already have solutions for. I think the key for implementing problems that have easy solutions is to set up the problem under conditions that make it hard for those solutions to reach the problem. For example, going back to the disease again, sure, most diseases in D&D can be cured with a simple cast of a spell or drink of a potion. But what if the disease is spreading too fast to keep up with? Casting that kind of healing magic all day would be exhausting. And depending on the setting, there is almost certainly a limited amount of healers and resources available. So really, you can make any kind of easily solvable problem work in your setting if you can turn it into a logistical nightmare. But problems aren't necessarily the only things that can drive adventures. Sometimes adventures are about discovery and exploration. Sometimes the players just want to snoop around an ancient temple and see if there are any goodies inside. Things like lost or forgotten mysteries and forbidden knowledge can be excellent focus points for adventures, so it can't hurt to put some stuff like that into your world. Broadly speaking, I think it's a good idea to make sure those things like lost temples and forgotten mysteries are in hard-to-reach places, somewhere you couldn't just find with a high perception roll. Make it an adventure or a journey to actually find the place. Sprinkle some clues or bits of information around, and let the players find them and connect the dots. There are tons and tons of ways to come up with ideas, but one of my favorites is to just ask myself questions. It's like fanning the flames of my own curiosity. The first one I always start with is, what if? This can be about anything. A person, a place, an event, some kind of thing to get the ball rolling and get the figurative gears in my head to start spinning. And when I say it can be about anything, I mean anything. What if somebody was like this? Or what if these things fell out of the sky? Or what if those people worshipped a mouse? They don't all have to be good ideas, but eventually you'll stumble across one that you like and keep wanting to think about. The goal is to keep trying out pieces to see what would fit in your world. I understand that it might be difficult if you've never tried something like that before, or if you're not really sure what to ask about, or even how to think of scenarios like that. But I promise that if you start small and keep trying, you'll get better at it. just like any other skill. I'm going to use an example so you can see how I run through these kinds of things. What if a meteor crashed into a big city? So now that we have the what, let's think about the logistics of that. First of all, I don't really know much about meteors, so I'd start by doing some research about any kind of real or fictional impacts. And not just meteors either, but other kinds of disasters around a big city and how the people reacted to it. Maybe things like the volcanic eruption at Pompeii, or the nuclear bombs in World War II, or even something like the giant meteor suspended above Vivek City in Morrowind. Now that we have the what and some of the logistics for what would happen, let's ask why. Was it just cosmic coincidence? Did some eldritch entity throw it from the deepest reaches of space? Did a god call it down upon their followers who angered them? With the why, this is where you can get into what you want the event to mean in your setting. Does it have a larger significance to reinforce a broader theme in your world? Or is it just a random bad thing that happened? Because natural disasters do happen. The last question for this is how? More specifically, how does blank affect the setting? This is where you can focus more on the specifics and what you want the end result to be. Does the meteor destroy the city entirely, or only part of it? Were there survivors? How did the rest of the setting respond to it, if at all? This is how you figure out the potential after effects or ramifications for whatever the what if is. Hopefully, when you get to the end of the how section, you can start getting more ideas branching off of that and use one of those smaller points to start a new what if. And maybe you can find ways to connect multiple what ifs or hows to other ideas, whether it's multiple ideas sprouting from one single thing, or several things culminating together to form a new what if. It's something I use all the time, and I think it's a great tool to keep the ideas flowing organically. Realism is a tricky thing for fantasy worlds. I think when a lot of people think of realism, what they really mean or want is believable or reasonable. If something is realistic, then it's going to be like our real world. But we don't have things like magic or dragons. However, we did have big scaly dinosaurs, and we do have animals like skunks that can shoot chemicals. So the idea of dragons is somewhat believable if you combine those two things together and bend a couple rules. In fantasy, you have the potential to do a lot of wacky and outlandish things. But since we still take a lot of real things and put them into fantasy worlds, we need those things to be reasonable and somewhat realistic. We need the world to adhere to some form of realism like gravity or the fundamental forces of nature. But the cool thing about fantasy is that you can bend realism and still be reasonable with it. If something works one way in the real world, but then another way in your world, you need to have a reason for that. You don't necessarily have to know the exact, detailed explanation, but having a reason can help to make it make sense for you and the players without breaking anyone's immersion. For example, if there's a specific river in your world that flows up a mountain, and your reasoning for it is because it does, or because I think it's cool, then that's going to feel kind of lame and forced. But if you give it a reason, any reason, now it can make sense to some degree. Maybe some god reversed the gravity in that area as a prank. Maybe the water is being siphoned by some kind of magic device at the top of the mountain. Or maybe there are ley lines deep under the earth that change the river's flow. The line between reasonable and unreasonable is kind of blurry with stuff like this. If you want something unrealistic to work in your world, you need to put a good amount of thought into making the explanation believable. However, you only need enough of an explanation to make you or the players think, oh, okay. But how do you know what's enough? Well, that's why the line is kind of blurry. Part of it depends on how realistic you want the setting to be, but another part depends on how well you can blend fact and fiction. You know that idea of the best lies have an element of truth to them? If you can get just a little bit of realistic fact in the explanation, that can go a long way to making it more believable. So, to recap, Create a world that can actually work for D&D. Make a place that's teeming with adventure, a place with hostility, and dark corners, and mysteries to uncover. Make a place that lets the players utilize their characters to solve problems and discover things. And if you're hurting for ideas, learn to ask yourself questions. What if? Why? How? Let yourself be curious and follow any threads that catch your attention. Follow your own curiosity and think of ways to connect some of those ideas once you find them. And lastly, don't get too caught up with being realistic. You don't really need things to be realistic in D&D, just believable. And you only need a small, partial truth or fact in order to push something over the edge to being reasonable. That's all I've got for now. If you get any use from my advice, I'd love to hear how it went, or even your own ideas about it. Either way, good luck.